So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Courtney co-founded EmergingMEd in January of 2000 after spending 3 years as a health services research analyst and institutional sales representative for CIBC Oppenheimer in New York City. Prior to joining the boutique investment firm, Courtney worked to launch 3 consecutive Medicaid-focused HMO startups on the East Coast. The creation of EmergingMED's patented clinical trial navigation services reflects Courtney's commitment to creating systemic solutions that coordinate access to care and empower patients and healthcare providers with unbiased information to make more informed decisions. Please welcome our presenter. All yours, Courtney. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Appreciate it. And my thanks to Cher for hosting this webinar. And I'm very happy to be here today. My goal is to help those of you who are looking for or considering clinical trials, make sure you've got a good sound knowledge of how to go about a search and how to get some help with that process. There are a lot of clinical trials out there and a lot of confusion sometimes around how clinical trials work and what they may or may not offer you. So this is the fact versus fiction discussion, and I've got some slides and want to speak and share some information with you for about half an hour and then leave a half an hour open for questions. Oops. So with that, let's talk about how to get a search done, what's out there, about targeted therapies and genomic testing, tumor profiling, considerations for phase 1 trials that are, I think, worth knowing about and important and very different than maybe 5-10 years ago. And then, as I said, discussions and questions. So we want you to have a strategy about when and how you're going to search for trials, and then make sure you can get access. And EmergingMEd has been running the shared cancer clinical trial matching service for a number of years now, and would certainly welcome and welcome the opportunity to help each and every one of you and those that you work with or know who are also facing treatment decisions around breast cancer. You can see on the bottom of this page that the Share Cancer Support website has a clinical trial section and a phone number that's specifically dedicated for the clinical trial matching service, the 877-769-4832. So we do encourage everybody to use that service. And this is just sort of an excerpt of what it looks like on the website, available in Spanish as well. And the idea with the matching service for an individual or a physician that's looking on behalf of a patient to find clinical trials, the idea is that if you can complete a breast cancer profile, we will, and keep that up to date, we will submit it and compare your answers on that profile to every cancer clinical trial that will accept a breast cancer patient in the United States, which means we have probably around 800 trials coded for matching against those questionnaires. So that is the best way we can help you find trials that are very much specifically looking for somebody with your specific diagnosis, stage, and treatment history. We recommend that after you fill out the questionnaire, or if you want to do that over the phone, you then talk to one of our navigators. I wouldn't suggest searching for clinical trials entirely by yourself. There's a lot that can be confusing and a lot that we can help you with behind the scenes, particularly in getting connected with the trial sites that are running trials and studies that you might find interesting. I am in this talk going to use the word trial or study interchangeably, and as far as I can tell, there's really no difference. They mean the same thing. And we would always recommend both that you discuss clinical trial options with your doctor if you're comfortable doing that, but that's always a very important idea and good idea. And then second, the other thing to know is that if and when you find a clinical trial match that looks interesting to you, you're also free to call the trial site that's running that trial to get more information. And they are, one, expecting your call, and two, happy to work with you to explore a little bit further whether any particular clinical trial that you may have found in your match results really, if you dig deeper, really seems like it might be a good idea, and that can help you figure out kind of the questions to ask to dig in deeper about that. So when you find trials of interest or a trial that you would like to pursue or learn more about, both talking to the trial site that's running the trial as well as discussing it with your doctor are two things we would recommend. We're here to make sure you can find those matches and then get connected with those trial sites. And if folks aren't returning your phone calls, or you're running into other logistical problems getting connected with a trial site, let us know. Talk to your navigator about that, and there's a number of things we can do behind the scenes to help with that. So the clinical trial matching service, free of charge, it's confidential, and we're happy to help anytime. Some basics about clinical trials. They may or may not, there may or may not ever be a clinical trial that's right for you. We wanted to make sure that you, and always want to make sure that you know your options. We want to make sure that you understand that there's a clinical trial basically for each decision point you come to. Each time that you're thinking about making a treatment decision, that's going to be a point in time when there are clinical trials designed to be, that want to be the next thing you would do, that are testing out their therapy or their new drug or their new combination for you at that stage. So there's really a wide range of clinical trials, and offered for everything from somebody who's newly diagnosed to somebody who's had 4 or 5 previous regimens. There's always a next thing to look for there. So therefore, we encourage you to look for clinical trials each time you're making a treatment decision. Always know that you are never required to enroll in a clinical trial, and if you do enroll, you're never required to stay in the clinical trial. That is, so by law, by policy, number of protections in place, but those are key. And if you're using our service to find your matches and get access, you're not obligated in any way, shape, or form to act on the information or to enroll. It is meant for you to gather information, and everybody that runs clinical trials and is involved in this industry in any way expects that you'll need to gather up information for yourself, or to share with your family members, to share with your doctors perhaps, and that's what we're here to help with. So again, getting information should not be seen as in any way, shape, or form obligating you to enroll in a trial or stay in a trial. That's just not the case. It's a complicated decision, and a complicated set of information to look at and review, just like some of the treatment decisions you're making. So a clinical trial is testing and really measuring whether a new therapy of some kind is better or worse than standard of care that's out there, or better and worse than doing nothing in some cases. So the clinical trials are designed to explore the risk or the benefit of the new therapies. Often I think we think of clinical trials as a new drug, an experimental drug, but sometimes it's just a new combination of drugs or therapies that are already known. The first time they get combined, they need to be done in a clinical trial and measured. And sometimes a clinical trial is just about changing the dosage or the sequence of therapies or treatments drugs you might be getting already, or that women may have been getting for breast cancer treatment for years. If we knew that the experimental drug was better than the standard of care or what was out there, we wouldn't need to run the clinical trial, but we don't know that. So if there's a clinical trial going on, it's because we very specifically don't know if it's better or worse than the other options you might have. The only time a placebo is used in a clinical trial, or the only time you would only get a placebo, is when there is not any option that has ever worked and been successful for a particular group of patients with a kind of particular stage in the journey. Generally, the way a clinical trial in cancer is designed, and particularly in breast cancer, is you're going to get standard of care with or without the experimental arm. And sometimes if you're getting the arm of the study that's the standard of care without the experimental drug, you might get a placebo just so you can't tell and your doctor can't tell which arm of the study you're on. But rarely in cancer is there ever a situation where you'd be giving a placebo and nothing else. Those are really rare cases and only occur when nothing has ever worked, and therefore testing the new drug against the placebo is the only thing out there, because there's nothing better than doing nothing or watch and wait that anybody's found. That's a pretty rare situation. Something else I wanted you all to be aware of is that the phases and the designs of clinical trials have changed a little bit recently. A lot of this having to do with genomic testing, biomarkers, and the pace at which some of these new insights and new trials can be done. So where in the past a sponsor of a trial, and the sponsor could be a pharmaceutical company, it could be a medical center, it could be a research organization or a not-for-profit that's focusing on research. It used to be that whoever was running the trial would design a very distinct phase 1, wait for the results to be analyzed, then launch a phase 2, wait for the results to be analyzed and if successful, then launch a phase 3 trial. And the phase 3 trial, it is the results of those phase 3 trials that in general would be submitted to the FDA in hopes of getting approval for the drug that, or the therapy that had been successful. But things are moving a little faster now, and with targeted therapies, you can more quickly oftentimes see the success or the failure of a drug sooner. So what's happening is when trials are designed now, they're being designed with kind of two sections or 2 phases to them. One is a kind of phase 1 study that would be traditional, and then it'll roll right into and just convert into a phase 2 if certain predetermined success points are reached. Same thing's happening in phase 2 trials. They're often now being designed to be a phase 2 that rolls right into a phase 3 if after the first certain number of patients have come through, if they've had successful results, and again at a threshold that was predetermined, then that trial is going to run straight into a phase 3. So if you're looking for a clinical trial, and suppose you wanted a phase 3 clinical trial, it may be that you want to look at trials that are phase 3 or that are phase 2 that look like they could just convert right into a phase 3 without a delay. Because when you stop and then have to start an entirely new trial as opposed to just phasing into a new portion of the trial, when you have to stop and start all over again, easily there can be a 6 or 12 month delay in there. But when you've got a trial that's designed to roll directly from a phase 1 into a phase 2 if it's successful, or phase 2 right into a phase 3 if it meets the right endpoints, that can happen over the course of a few weeks and really saves everybody time. And it's all the more reason to remind you that the point of a clinical trial is to provide a very specific treatment plan to a very specific population and then measure what happens. And you get measured and more tests done in a clinical trial than certainly in routine care from your doctor. That's the point. They need to know exactly what's happening, and they want to know, if you're in a clinical trial, whether the arms of the study are actually producing the results that you're getting. So if it's good news, can they be sure that it's the new treatment that's bringing about that result? I mentioned before, we're going to have you in a profile that you submit to find your trial matches. We're going to basically be looking to clarify and specify your diagnosis, your stage, and your treatment history. Those are the key points to which you've got to match the eligibility criteria of a clinical trial. And now oftentimes there are tumor biomarkers that are being looked at, genomic analysis. What alterations happened in your tumor that seem to be driving your tumor cells growth? Those are now getting worked into eligibility criteria, or things that are certainly going to be tested for along the way. So when we're gathering information about you, it's to compare your profile with the eligibility criteria of trials. And again, diagnosis, stage, and treatment history are really the most important things there. One other thing to understand about clinical trials is there's almost always an interim analysis that's built in, which means at the halfway point, when half of the people have been enrolled and been watched for the kind of minimum amount of time specified up front, there's this side group of data analysts that are going to look at the results, and only the small group is going to be able to look at the results. They're not actually people running the trial, but they call it a Data Safety and Monitoring Board, DSMB, Data Safety and Monitoring Board. And they're going to be able to see the results of the first half of the study, and if the results are overwhelmingly positive or overwhelmingly negative, then they're going to unblind the study, and generally the sponsor is going to announce out loud that the study's being either halted or adjusted based on those results. And the idea is that if you know for certain, because of the first half of the results, that the trial is overwhelmingly positive, then it would be unethical to withhold that knowledge and that treatment from anybody else going forward, when in fact mathematically they've already proven their point that the new therapy is better. So they will release that information. The other side of that is, if the results of the first half of the study, the first half of the people enrolled, was so overwhelmingly either neutral or negative, meaning either there's no difference between the control group, or in fact the people on the new experimental therapy are doing worse than people in the control group who are presumably receiving standard of care. If the results are sort of not impressive, or negative, then they're likely to halt the study right then and there. So it is always something to look at too. If you're considering a clinical trial, you may want to ask whether, well, first of all, what's going to trigger the interim analysis? And then are they in the first half or the second half of the study? Are they in the part of the study before they've reached the interim analysis or afterwards? Just to tell you, it tells you a little bit more about how far it's gone through and how much is known. One of the stories I like to tell, if you haven't heard it before, is, and it's what I'm referencing here at the bottom of this slide 6, is that if you weren't aware, childhood leukemia used to have about an 80% mortality rate. 80% of the kids diagnosed with leukemia would not make it even 5 years. Over the course of about 20 years, without any new drugs, just by changing the order and the combination and the timing of, and some of the dosages of the existing chemotherapies, radiation, the leukemia specialists, the pediatric oncologists have been able to get that 80% mortality rate into an 80% survival rate. No new drugs, just by clinical trials measuring every kid who was diagnosed with leukemia and working and tweaking and looking for exactly what was working better or worse in everybody. The moral of the story here is that clinical trials, they're about measuring what's happening. And the more we learn and the faster we learn, the more it helps individuals. The more it helps you, the more it helps the next person behind you in line. But it's a story I wanted all of you to be aware of. It's in the pediatric oncology world, doctors are much better about putting patients on clinical trials. In the pediatric world, the doctor has to explain why the child is not being put on a clinical trial, as opposed to having to talk somebody into going on a clinical trial. 80–85% of children diagnosed with cancer are put on a clinical trial. I would certainly love if that were the same case with adults, and that you had lots of options to use as well. But you can learn fast, and it can be incredibly impressive. So in this talk, we're focusing more on metastatic breast cancer treatment trials, and I wanted to, the process is the same for somebody with localized breast cancer or early stage breast cancer as well. But a couple things that I want you to be aware of, and which is true for any cancer clinical trial, particularly for this group. A clinical trial is designed to replace an existing treatment or to prove that it's better than an existing treatment at some point along the way for a very specific part of the population. So to do that, they expect that you've had standard of care along the way. If you have off-label care, you might render yourself ineligible for a clinical trial. It depends on what you have and what your treatment is and why it was given. But one of the things I want you to be aware of is that the trial has to prove that it is, better than, basically the standard of care that's out there. So it can only enroll people who've been following that path. So ask your doctor. I think it's a good idea to ask your doctor when you're making a treatment decision, particularly early on, are you getting a standard of care? And if not, talk carefully about whether or not a clinical trial is an option, and would a clinical trial be an option after the therapy that you might be considering. I want you to be aware of that up front. There's lots of, every person's situation is different, but we wouldn't want you to be surprised later and not realize that you can always have off-label care, but a clinical trial is pretty particular about enrolling people who've had kind of the same treatments and are at the same stage of their cancer. The second thing to keep in mind is that there's a narrow window of time usually to enroll in a clinical trial. If you're newly diagnosed, there's some trials that want to enroll you before you've had surgery, some that want to enroll you within 8 to 12 weeks of finishing surgery, for example. So clinical trials are always something to, I'd say, again, explore if possible before you need it. And then second, if you're going to look for clinical trials, understand what kind of time frame you might beyond. It's going to be an important thing to consider, because generally, again, the trial's designed to enroll a very specific group of patients at a specific point in time, and that's why they set some windows of eligibility. So we're going to dig in now to a little bit more about the clinical trials that are open today for metastatic breast cancer, and this is a poll of the EmergingMEd database as of Friday. There are 261 studies available right now, very specifically designed for women with metastatic breast cancer. Actually, men and women with metastatic breast cancer. There are about 40 unique drugs being tested in these clinical trials. Half of them, 25 of them, are targeted agents, hitting about 40 different alterations. And by that I mean, if you get your tumor tested for its genomic alterations, what changed about your tumor or about your cells that is making that tumor grow or making it resistant to dying when cells in your body normally would. These are the mutation analyses that are alterations that are going to get tested for and reported back to you in genomic testing. And some drugs can hit more than one target, and that's why you've got 25 targeted agents in clinical trials hitting about 40 different targets. It's not always known whether hitting the target is a good or a bad thing for you, so something else to look at, but they're out there, and certainly some of the results for some targeted agents have been really, really impressive, and the industry and the researchers are really, really hopeful, and there's a lot to be hopeful for. There are about 16 chemotherapies that are in clinical trials right now, 9 hormonal therapies in clinical trials, and then 2 immunotherapies, one targeting PD-1 and the other targeting a PD-L1 proteins are in clinical trials. So those 261 studies are combinations of these drugs and chemotherapies and hormonal therapies. So just in general, there's the lay of the land. And now let's dig into a little deeper to the kind of the patient journey, if you will, here. These are clinical trials designed for kind of each stage of the journey, and I wanted you to understand what's out there. So for these 261 trials, there are, and again, very much for recurrent or metastatic breast cancers. 55 of these studies are what we call neoadjuvant studies. They want to enroll you or the patient before having surgery, usually because they want to collect tissue during the surgery that can be analyzed. There's other reasons for it too, but those are called neoadjuvant. If surgery is the main, surgery and maybe radiation are the main treatments, neoadjuvant means that it's coming before the surgery and or the radiation. 5 trials want to enroll patients right after surgery, and generally that's going to mean 8 weeks after surgery or 12 weeks after surgery, some limited amount of time. That's the narrow window. They're going to want to enroll people in these studies. Oftentimes you may need to have known about that study before you go into surgery in order to be eligible and get the paperwork done and consented and informed about that study beforehand. So this is one of those situations, and these groups of trials are ones that, and part of the reason we recommend that you look really from the moment you're diagnosed, as you're working with your doctor, explore clinical trials just to find out what options you might have, just in case there's something you want to consider and you have to make the decision before you go into surgery. It's tough. Usually you would need your surgeon often to tell you about these, but they're out there. Some of them are very interesting, so wanted to make sure you were aware of that. And I think probably far too many women are not made aware of those studies. So that if you had a way to help people find out about them when they're newly diagnosed, that would be enormously, I think, helpful. And then there are 15 clinical trials that want to be what's called first-line treatment. The first thing you do after you have surgery and or radiation, if those are the case. These are called first-line trials. They're systemic, and these are a combination of endocrine or hormone treatments, maybe with a targeted therapy, with or without chemotherapy, or with or without radiation. But there's 15 different studies that want to be, as I said, first thing you do after, the first treatment you take after your surgery and radiation. And then depending on what happens with this first-line treatment, then you've got kind of two paths that are going to happen. If you fully respond to that first-line treatment, then you're going to be basically watched, and you're going to be watched closely by your doctor. And there are 2 studies out there to prevent recurrence or to delay recurrence of the cancer after a full response to a first-line treatment. So ones you'd be aware of those, not too many of them, but a couple of them right now, and those certainly come up from time to time. And if you respond to that first-line treatment, but at any point in the future, the cancer comes back or spreads further or comes back into the same place, then you switch over into what's called the second and third line therapies, where there was a partial or no response, or partially responded at first, but then the cancer seems to have come back completely. Then there are 184 studies for what's called, sorry for my typo, what's called relapsed or recurrent breast cancer. And the second treatment you would then take here would be called the second line therapy, or third line therapy would be the third line of treatment you might take. And there, as I said, there are 184 studies in here. Some very much want to be the second line that you might try. Some want to be the third line that you would try, but they're generally designed very specifically for those. And after you have a second line treatment, for example, you're going to be, again, watched and followed up with your doctor and the clinical trial site. And then if that doesn't work, and there's, again, a partial or no response, or it works for a while, but then your cancer comes back, there are more studies there as well. So these are kind of really called 6 or 7 points along that treatment continuum that there are clinical trials available. And each block of those trials has kind of unique characteristics. Each of those is designed around standard of care, and that's what they're going to be comparing, evaluating you for as you move through there. But I want you to be aware of kind of the fact that there are, first of all, clinical trials for that whole continuum from the moment somebody has a diagnosis, and then there's a lot to do, and again, these are very specifically for metastatic breast cancer. Things go on 4th, 5th, 6th line therapy, if you will. There's also then a group of solid tumor trials, and these are clinical trials that are phase 1 trials. We'll talk about them more in a second, but there's about another 350 clinical trials out there in the United States today that will accept a person who's got breast cancer, which is considered a solid tumor. It grows into a solid mass, and you could be eligible for any of those as well. And those are generally for second, third, fourth line patients, but people who've tried other therapies and they haven't worked. So there's a whole other block you can try in addition to these 261 trials, very specifically for metastatic breast cancer. We talk for a minute more about the targeted therapies and genomic profiling. Again, everybody's tumor is different. There are certainly patterns that you can see when you test for the alterations of the genomic mutations in a cancer cell, and particularly people with the same type of cancer sometimes show patterns. But that if you've been able to be tested or want to get tested, it can often certainly point you in certain directions, and you and your doctor gives you a lot to work with in terms of what's driving your particular cancer, and it can help you understand what therapies you may want to take and which therapies are not likely to do any good. In part because there may not be any place for the therapy in question, or certain therapies to really attach to. And this is something I think most of you have probably been tested for estrogen, progesterone, and your HER2 status. HER2 is a good example of this, where if you have the HER2 protein on your cancer cells, then there's a place for a HER2 sort of inhibitor to attach to your cancer cell and block it, like Herceptin. If you don't have that protein, then there's nothing for something like Herceptin to attach to, and therefore no reason to take it. So that's really the model by which targeted therapies and genomic profiling are hoping that they can help you. There may or may not be a clinical trial open today that takes into account the alterations or the genomic mutations that your tumor has very specifically. The testing is ahead of drug development in some cases, but it may be that literally tomorrow or 6 months from now, there may be new, and there is certainly a continual development and emergence of new therapies being tested. There are 150 new clinical trials a day for all types of cancer, and the hundreds of new drugs being added to clinical trials, including for breast cancer, really each year. So what started off as maybe being 10 or 15 targeted therapy clinical trials going on, for which you may want to get genomic testing. Now there's something like 900 agents that fall into that targeted therapy category, and more coming. And there's more alterations that are getting tested for diagnostic tests that are looking at and trying to classify the mutations and genomic alterations of your cancers. One of the other things that's being looked at, and a good thing to ask your doctor about, is when you've got cancer, the one thing we all know is that your cells need a break, and there is a belief that cancer cells know how to mutate, and there's always a question of whether the tumor is changing over time. Is the tumor and the cancer you were first diagnosed with, does it look the same later? Does it look the same after you've had a targeted therapy for a treatment or immunotherapy as a treatment? So that's something to keep in mind and to ask your doctor about, and to explore testing for as well. Excuse me. I want to make sure you knew about phase 1 trials. And I know that even in my own family, which has had its share of cancer diagnoses, there's a lot of confusion about this. And while my family was sort of happy to hear me talk about EmergingMED's clinical trial matching service and the new developments going on in research, they really didn't believe me when I talked about what's happening with phase 1 clinical trials when we had the most recent family member diagnosed. So we put this together in part to help them and to remind folks that phase 1 trials are a little bit different than they used to be in certain ways, and I wanted to make sure you were aware of that. A phase 1 trial, the first time a new therapy is being used in humans, in patients, but it can also be a combination of therapies that are actually known but haven't been combined before, or new dosage schedules, for example. Hundreds of new targeted therapies, and so lots of questions. If you hit a target, does that slow the cancer down or does it speed it up? There's lots to think about there, and a lot that's still being tested for. But a couple things I wanted you to all be aware of. It used to be that phase 1 trials and an agent being tested in a phase 1 clinical trial was only looking at safety and the maximum tolerated dose. Now they are looking at anti-cancer activity. And for a drug to make it out of phase 1 trials into phase 2 trials, it's got to show that it somehow seems to be slowing down or stopping somebody's cancer in some way. Otherwise, it's going to be hard pressed to get support for being moved into a phase 2 clinical trial. Which brings me to the second point on here, which is when I first started EmergingMED in 2000, maybe 1 in 10 therapies that made it into a phase 1 clinical trial actually moved on to a phase 2 trial. So 1 in 10 would, nine of them would go back to the lab or just be shelved. Now, last I heard, the number's about 70% of the agents in phase 1 trials being successful enough to be moved on to phase 2 clinical trials and move forward. They're different. They're more targeted. More is known about them coming through. You still, in a phase 1 trial, have to understand that it is about safety up front. The second, then, is its anti-cancer activity. Is it having any impact? So the safety aspect of what's being tested and looked at in a phase 1 trial is still the same. But 70% of agents are being deemed to be safe enough and have showing some kind of anti-cancer activity to move forward, which is much better odds and much more interesting than 17 years ago. There are 700, but I think that's probably closer to 800 right now, new agents in phase 1 cancer clinical trials. And I'm sorry, I forgot to update this. There are 261 trials right now, and of agents, there's about 25 agents that are very specifically being tested in metastatic breast cancer. different numbers in different areas, but there's certainly many more for breast cancer than there are actually for ovarian cancer in total. One of the tricky things about phase 1 trials is they have a very limited number of openings. They generally enroll 3 patients, wait to see exactly what happens, watch them very closely for a while, and then they will enroll the next 3 patients. They do it kind of very, very phased, very slow in time. So if by some chance there is a drug that you're interested in or treatment you're interested in that's only in a phase 1 clinical trial, it might be that you need to contact that investigator or that medical center to get it to become one of their patients, or kind of get a second opinion there to get on their rolls and get registered there before they would consider you for a clinical trial, just because of the limited number of openings and the limited number of sites. Phase 1 trial may be open at just 1 site or 2 or 3 hospitals, for example. Another thing to consider in a phase 1 clinical trial is how many patients have had that therapy before. There's a big difference, I would say, in certainly being the first human to ever have a new treatment. That is about as risky as it gets. If you're the 100th person going on to a phase 1 study, the 100th person to have had take that treatment, then a little bit more is known about it. Still risky, still a lot to consider, but it's different. So I would always encourage you to ask, if you're considering a phase 1 clinical trial or you want to consider one, are you the first person, the 10th, the 100th person to come in? That will tell you something different about how much is known about that agent. So at this point, let's open this up for questions.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you.
So a bunch of questions came in. Number 1, are patient preferences, such as distance someone is willing to travel, or a preference for an oral medication, or a desire, for example, of not to lose one's hair, is that part of what's asked when filling out the initial questionnaire?
Not when filling out the questionnaire. It's a good question. The questionnaire is meant to clinically help you identify trials that would accept you. And if you're obviously not a match to something, we don't want to waste your time or the site's time. Things like distance or whether it's an oral medication will come up as you look at the results and review the results. So you can filter your results and only look at trials that are close to you, or that have drugs that are oral medications, for example. So those are absolutely things you can find. But we're not going to eliminate options for anybody based on preferences. As I said, this is a clinical match to get you started, and then we can work with you to help winnow down your results and narrow it in from there. And for example, you can look for specific drugs and evaluate those that are maybe more likely or less likely, for example, to cause hair loss, for example. So you can do that when evaluating the results, and that's something the navigator can help you with.
Okay, thank you. Can you define off-label?
Sure. There aren't enough people in the world and enough with cancer for every drug to be tried and tested and evaluated in every type of cancer. So sometimes it becomes very common practice to use certain drugs that technically haven't been through a clinical trial for your particular situation, but they're commonly used or can be tried by, your doctor can prescribe them and give them to you. And technically, any doctor can legally prescribe any medication he or she wants to. So off-label means you are getting a treatment that wasn't tested or proven out in your particular type of cancer. Sometimes that can happen because there hasn't been enough time to do the study. Sometimes there aren't enough patients to do the study. And sometimes it's just something that a doctor wants to try. And whether your insurance covers it or not is something you probably talk to your doctor about as well, or you might find out in the course of getting treated. So off-label is something that is not only not officially tested in your particular situation, but by off-label, that also mean it's not standardly given, and therefore nobody could have designed a clinical trial around that having been given to a lot of patients because it's not either not as common, or let me say just generally not as common. Does that make sense, or did I just make that even more confusing? It's a tough area to talk about. Doctors give off-label therapy all the time, and sometimes it seems perfectly legit, and other times, like with my own family members on occasion, it really it puts you in a tough place because it can close some doors for you as well. So just something to ask about and understand why your doctor is giving you the options, making the recommendations that he or she is.
Thank you. The next question, can you clarify what's meant by recurrent or metastatic breast tumors? Like, people are confused about whether when you're speaking about recurrent, was it metastatic recurrence, or are the 261 trials available to metastatic patients?
Yep, 261 trials are available to metastatic patients. Some are available to metastatic patients who are newly diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. Others are, some of those other trials are offered for women who have been treated before for metastatic breast cancer and moved on. So recurrent means it's back, but you started with, it's back, maybe you started with a localized cancer and it came back to the same place. That's a recurrence. You could have started with metastatic breast cancer. A treatment looks like it made it go away, and then later on it came back. That would also be considered recurrent. Or relapsed, similar concept. But all of those 261 are for women who have been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer and then treated with some number of treatments along the way.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions about trial design. What do you think about parallel tracks in clinical trials, given that inclusion criteria are so strict that many patients who may benefit are excluded from participating? If industry or academia, for example, were required to offer a parallel track, perhaps huge strides could be made, as was the case in HIV and AIDS testing.
Can we clarify what you mean by parallel tracks?
So if additional trials were offered with other patients who were not eligible for this trial for some reason, but who may benefit from the drug. So maybe they aged out, or
they missed the window of eligibility, or I mean, that would be ideal. It would be spectacular if there was a way that more people could both participate in clinical trials and or kind of safely consider new therapies being developed. I think one of the trickiest things here is one, just the amount of money it costs to run trials. I think it's just one of the realities here of the situation. How many can you afford to run at one time? How many can the sponsor support? It's tricky along the way. I mean, there are multiple trials going on. The question is, how close are they? How many women? How many people can they really accept? It would be ideal, but I think the reality is that it can be tough. I will remind everybody that at some point a clinical trial's got to be able to prove that it's as good as or better than some other option that's out there. And one of the other realities, in addition to the cost of running all these clinical trials, is that the more that people have a new experimental drug outside of the clinical trial, if there are bad results, it could stop a drug from being developed because of the risk, or without ever getting an answer as to whether that therapy is really helpful or not. So complicated question, great idea, and certainly trial designs are getting better, but yeah, they can be restrictive for reasons that are really, really tough and not fun. So we're hoping that the matching service can at least help you not accidentally miss an option for things like, being a week late in contacting the site from kind of your own window of eligibility.
So another question about trial design. Why are men excluded from most metastatic breast cancer trials?
Good question. Well, hormone therapy, I would assume, would be one of it. One reason, I don't know, actually.
So that would be a good question to ask some of our researchers or oncologists that we work with. Can you talk a little bit about when someone is matched with a number of clinical trials, say maybe 10 to 25, what kind of services can the navigator help with to help you sort of narrow down the list, to help you decide what the best trial is for you?
Sure. I would start with a couple of things. One is, do you have any genomic test results that would aim you in one direction or another? Any results that would help you avoid certain therapies with certain mechanisms of action or steer you towards others? I would look at location. It is, you've got to show up a number of times regularly for a cancer clinical trial. So I would think very carefully about where you're looking for one, and certainly if your own doctor is running clinical trials, or your own the medical center that you're getting your treatment, somebody close by can be important just for logistics and the realities of life sometimes. There are modalities, which somebody mentioned, I think, in a previous question. So if you want an oral medication, if you want a targeted therapy, if you want an immunotherapy, those can be different treatment modalities that you can search by as well. I would encourage everybody to remember that sometimes a targeted therapy or an immunotherapy is designed or intended to make chemotherapy work better. So sometimes people come to us and say, oh, I don't want chemotherapy, which we both really understand, but just know that sometimes therapies are being combined. So those are the beginning points, I think, for narrowing. And then I would say, if you get if you can narrow down a short list of those that are local, I would strongly encourage you to go and talk to the trial site and see if there's any, and see what the trial site has to say, because they will also help you figure out in more depth right off the bat whether their trial seems like an interesting one for you to pursue further. And then if I were you, I'd talk to my doctor as well, if that's possible. But you can go ahead and gather information from the trial sites. They expect to field those kinds of questions, and that can really help, and particularly places that are close by that might be more helpful. And all of this also taking into account that you may or may not have any genomic test results on your tumor that would aim you in one direction or another.
Right. And how can patients identify rollover trials?
It will actually say phase 1-2 or phase 2-3 in them. That will be when you look at the phase. That's your clue.
Okay. We got a number of questions, so we're just sorting through a couple. One here. Hang on.
While you're looking at that, both the good news and the bad news about breast cancer clinical trials is that anybody developing a cancer drug would hope that they can find a group within the breast cancer community that their therapy works for. Therefore, if there's a new therapy being developed, you're likely to be able to get your hands on it in a breast cancer clinical trial. But that does mean, as you saw before, that there could be, for recurrent or relapsed or advanced metastatic breast cancer, you could have 184 options. That can be tricky. And then anybody with advanced cancer is going to match to probably all 350 phase 1 trials. So that can be a lot to search through.
So there are a couple of questions about cost of clinical trials to the patient.
Yeah.
So maybe you could speak a little bit about cost, and then specifically, is it true that sometimes Medicaid won't pay for their portion of costs for people who enroll in trials out of state?
I'm not up to date on Medicaid, but because Medicaid is a shared state and federal insurance program, that might be the case. That would not be illogical, but I would say, explore that and research that right off the bat, if you think you're in that situation. And I would also say that Medicaid programs are administered differently state by state. So what might be true in North Carolina may not be true in South Carolina, for example. Generally, cancer clinical trials expect that your insurance will pay for the routine parts of care, and that the trial will cover the costs for the additional doctor's visits, the additional drugs, additional testing that are going to be needed. So the other way to say that is, if you have no insurance, a cancer clinical trial may not be something you'll be able to get into. I'd say if you find a trial you're interested in, contact the trial site. Every county, every state has different programs and basically pockets of money and/or policies. So in general, that's the answer is that your private insurance is expected, or Medicare is expected to cover the routine parts of care that you would get anyway, but ask. There are often other ways around, and once in a while, the sponsor of the trial will cover all the costs of a clinical trial. Doesn't happen. I'm not hearing about that a lot, but it's possible. So again, if you clinically find a trial that looks really interesting to you, ask and see what folks can do. I would expect, and you should expect, that any trial can cover the cost of your transportation, particularly driving and parking, things like that. The trial site has to make those judgments and administers all those details. So again, ask the trial site when you're exploring the trial.
Any ideas or any advice for patients whose oncologists don't seem very interested when the patient says that they're interested in participating in a clinical trial? Any ideas about how they can talk to their oncologist more effectively?
Interesting. I would generally say, this certainly happens more often than any of us wish. I would say stay at it. Oncologists will tend to respond, my experience has been, they will tend to respond to the patient. You may have to push and prod a little bit. I would say stay at it. We certainly have heard stories on occasion about a patient who will report that their doctor basically comes close to firing them if they push too hard. And it's a tough call, particularly depending on how many options you have where you live, but physicians should be willing to talk to you about it. What I would also say is you will have more time to search for clinical trials for yourself than your doctor will. Bringing options to them, not bringing all 25 trials you might find, but winnowing that down a little bit, doing a little homework on your own, can make it easier to talk about those. So if your doctor is really not supportive, walking in with one or two options where you've already talked to the trial site and you've vetted it a little bit up front to say, okay, I seem to be a reasonable candidate for this. I'm interested for this reason. What do you think? But unless your doctor is running some clinical trials, he or she is not going to know the details of the clinical trial that he or she is not running. Let me put it that way. So the more you can do on your own, you do not need your doctor's permission to go on a clinical trial. So we always hope that you can work with your doctor. May require a little more pushing and nudging than any of us would hope, but you have the right to consider it. You don't need your doctor's permission to go onto a clinical trial, and hopefully you can bring them in with you, because the more guidance and the more expertise you can bring to your decisions and to actually putting in the trial, the better.
And can you talk a little bit about the potential downside of participating in a clinical trial?
It's tricky. Sure. it may not work. There is no guarantee that in a clinical trial you won't do worse than you would have doing nothing or just taking the standard of care. And I would think that the clinical trials that would probably interest you the most, or should interest you the most, are those that have an experimental arm or experimental drug that interests you, and the standard of care and the arm that's being compared to in the study is what you were going to do anyway, what you and your doctor were talking about for your treatment. But there's no guarantee that you won't do worse, be worse off in a clinical trial, or have side effects that are bad and worse than you would have had otherwise from that. So again, the reason they're running clinical trials is there's a hope and a belief that the therapy will work and be beneficial for the group it's being offered to, but no guarantee. And even with targeted therapies, there have been some really great success stories with them, but there's also been at least one case I've heard about recently, and I'm sure there's more than one, where you hit the target and in fact that speeds up the growth of the cancer, not slows it down. So bad things can happen in a clinical trial as well. The one good thing about it that I would say is that you get measured and tested more often, so you'll know what's happening. But you could do worse in a clinical trial than standard of care or not doing anything. And I think it's important, if you're considering a clinical trial, really the decision's got to come down to what's called standard of care options, what clinical trial options do I have right now at this moment, what off-label options do I have, and then fourth, what happens if I do nothing? What does watch and wait or palliative care? What could I expect from that? And those are sort of the four categories that you're weighing, I think, each time you're making a treatment decision.
Great. And the last question, how often is the EmergingMEd website updated? So in other words, how often are new trials posted? How often should patients check? Or do they become notified when their criteria matches a clinical trial?
Sure. We're updating the database daily, from, in part, syncing from clinicaltrials.gov, but then we also work directly with a number of trial sites and a number of sponsors of trials and get information from their study teams directly. So it's being updated daily. I would say come back. We do schedule outreach and follow-up based on really, in particular, when you have kind of your next scans or expect to be making your next treatment decisions. But I would say every time you've got a new piece of information, I would go in and update my profile. So you get a new test result or you've started a new treatment. Update your profile, put in, mark off the new drugs that or the regimen that you're taking, and see what results you have and stay up to date on that. I would proactively, at least every couple of months, come back in or each time you're making a treatment decision or gearing up for that. Because trials open and close all the time as well.
So Courtney Hudson, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And again, you can check out sharecancersupport.org, check out the EmergingMEd matching service there. And thank you everyone for joining. If you wouldn't mind filling out the evaluation at the end of this webinar, we'd really appreciate it. Courtney, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Good luck.
Thanks, everyone.